Kia ora to those joining us in New Zealand, and welcome to everyone from around the world. I'm Doug Maarschalk, Director of AGLX Asia Pacific. We're delighted to host Zhen Goh for this webinar on transformation and change in complexity. Zhen is a Director at Emergenarium, based in Singapore, and she's also an associate of AGLX, having partnered with us on various projects over the last few years. She has 20 years of experience in organizational design, policy innovation, leadership development, and related fields, working in multiple industries, including Fortune 500 companies, government, and international agencies. She's also contributed to the evolution of methodologies and thought leadership associated with the Cynefin framework and complexity, which is how we at AGLX first connected with her. She is faculty at the Civil Service College, Singapore, and special lecturer for systems thinking for the National University of Singapore CSO program. As you would have seen on the invitation, Zhen co-authored Evolvability in Business, Enterprise Transformation in the Age of Complexity. This was published late last year. I don't know about you, but we're seeing a lot of our clients are going through transformations, and if they're not calling it a transformation, it's certainly significant change. So we're fortunate to have Zhen here with us today, sharing her rich academic grounding with real-world expertise around transformation and change and complexity. So how the session will run is we'll have a Q&A at the end. So I invite you to put questions in the chat along the way. And of course, if there's deafening silence at the end, we will allow you to come off mute and just have a general conversation, so we can kind of let that unfold as the session goes. So Zhen will talk sort of 30 to 40 minutes, then there'll be a Q&A. As I said, it is being recorded, and we'll send it out to you afterwards. So if you have to duck away, or if you feel like you've got someone else who couldn't be here today that really needs to hear what we talk about today, we encourage you to share the recording with them. So that's all from me. Over to you, Zhen, and thanks for everyone for joining.
Thank you very much, Doug. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. It's really nice to meet all of you. So I am dialing in from Singapore. So it's the first thing I'm doing this morning, and it's really nice to see all of you on the call. I'd like to also give thanks to Doug and Liz, who have coordinated and set this up. I shared with them earlier this morning that the book came out last year. It was exciting for me. I did probably a couple of interviews and podcasts, and then work got so busy that I kind of just left it. So I really appreciate the prompt, and I'm looking forward to speaking to all of you about some of the concepts and ideas in the book today. I will be introducing at a high level some of the general concepts around evolvability, what it means, how we thought through it in terms of transformation or change, particularly in the context of complexity. I will spotlight specific areas that actually Doug has said he thinks that would benefit some of the people that he has been working with, and he said that these are some of the things that I've seen them struggle with. So I'll be speaking specifically about a couple of frameworks with some examples, and I welcome questions, I welcome curiosities. I look forward to interacting with all of you. So with that, I will get started. The basic premise of the book is really this, is that what we've seen in the past, I would say 50, 60 years in academia is a lot of obsession with has the transformation or the change that you've put together succeeded or failed? There's a lot of sensationalization around transformation failure. So if you do a quick Google search, right, you'll notice that you see a lot of headlines that come out in the search hits. 70 to 95% of transformation or change efforts fail, right? This is a sensationalized headline. And one of the things that, always sort of bothered me about this is how can we say if something truly failed or succeeded? Because we know that in complex environments, right, that it's really difficult to fully understand all of the known and unknown consequences of any actions. So one of the things we realized is things that, in my clients, when I'm working with them, something that they said, oh, this failed, but we learned from this. That's very common. Or we did this 2 years ago, it didn't work, but, this is, a particular technical move that came out of it that we've been utilizing for the past 2 years, and it's really helped us. So that was the kind of thinking that inspired the book really. So we realized that a lot of change has been couched within this concept of maturity levels. So if we take a look at the chart on the right, it's basically we believe that the organization tends to be at specific stages of development. It could be we used to be here, now we're here, right? And then we should logically move on to the next stage of development, right? So in the book, my co-author Sunil actually had a chapter which writes about this. There is this very, I would say it's a viral photo. It's sort of like a meme that's making its way around the internet that talks about transformation, right? And how it goes from a caterpillar and then to a cocoon, to that pupa station, and into a butterfly. And people love to use this. I'm sure all of you have seen it either on LinkedIn or it's been sent to you. Yeah. One of the problems with this analogy when he and I had a chat is that I really don't like it. Yes, sure. The butterfly is beautiful. The caterpillar, surely had to go through this very difficult stage of transformation to achieve this new stage of flourishing. I said, but the issue is that we assume that we're caterpillars who are all going to turn into butterflies, right? The truth is, unlike a butterfly, where that evolutionary development is hard-coded into its DNA, a caterpillar can only ever become a butterfly. We might be caterpillars, but then the nature of how we are evolving, particularly as organizations, is that we're not all necessarily going to be hard-coded into butterflies at the next stage, right? We might develop horns. We might develop, webs, right? We don't know. We're not all butterflies, right? But presenting transformation in this way makes it seem hard-coded in your DNA. So what this inspired in me is, wow, I really want to go into some of the evolutionary biology that inspired this new move in thinking. Now, I am excited that we're starting to move into this more organic metaphors that we're using in terms of evolutionary biology, in terms of more organic sciences, right? Away from the mechanical type of metaphors that we've seen being used widely. So we know now that organizations are not machines. You can't just pull a lever, press a button, and expect the cogs to turn. We have that awareness now. However, when it comes to imagining what the future might look like, we are still falling very much into these assumptions of a linear journey, right? We might say, okay, we're here today. This is our imagined future. This is what we know, and therefore we're going to plan that. Right. But when I dug into the literature, what I found is this is a very simplistic representation of only one type of change that is possible to organisms. Right. So a lot of the inspiration that I took from the book was taken from this paper by Kirshner and Gearhart called Evolvability. They say that systems are doing at any given moment a few things, right? And they're doing this across multiple traits. So they are either optimizing. So after a variation has been achieved, it's successful, they want to repeat that, right? So this optimizing curve. This is something we're familiar with in business. A lot of our growth and development curves are based on the optimizing curve. But they say that any given point, we're also adapting, meaning we're always also at the same moment producing variability, mutating for novel traits, right? And also in some cases, they are frozen accidents, meaning it only happens once and we assume we can repeat it, right? So again, this is the proliferation of best practice. How do we repeat this? How do we actually bring this into organization? But they caution, they say the issue is natural selection, genuine evolutionary biology they work with what is best available at that time, right? But that actually goes against how we think. We say, what is the best possible, right? We believe that there is a strategic direction. We need to nudge it only in that strategic direction, right? So I wanted to understand where it is that the metaphor of evolution, evolutionary biology, can be effectively applied to business, and where, there are some issues with how we're thinking about it. These are where the differences are, and this is how we need to actually work with some of the challenges with applying this into human systems. So with that, I realized there are many shapes of adaptive change, right? So this first one, the directional curve that you see, is what we're most familiar with. This is that linear optimizing curve that we're so used to, believing that we always have to go toward the top right of the XY axis, right? So this is where they say a phenotype has adapted, it has achieved the right level of fitness, and we just need to really start to replicate that across the biological system. Right, so this is something that we're aware of. This is something we know, we're familiar with. However, they say that at any given point in time, right, that there are also other phenotypes that are going through that U-shaped curve where it's being disrupted because the environment has changed, there's some kind of trigger, and the phenotype realizes that what we are now maybe is not the best fit, but it's being disrupted because there is more than one direction it could change in, right? So that's why you have that U-shaped curve. The system hasn't yet identified where that adaptive fit is best. So it doesn't want to replicate it. It wants to go through this process of disruption. So it's testing what is best possible, right? Given the circumstances, given the types of resources that we have available, given the environmental stresses, right? It's actually going through that disrupting curve. And then we also have a stabilizing curve, right? Again, this is where the phenotypes that have been adapting, they've identified that, okay, I've identified that this is type of direction that we need to go through. But it doesn't go straight into a directional type of replication. It actually needs to go through a process of stabilization first. So what I found is adaptive change actually has many, many shapes. But the problem is we've become attached to only one shape and we keep using that one shape, right? So what I realized is, again, our systems probably look a lot more like this. Now, the curves that I've shown you, whether it's the directional, disrupting, or stabilizing, those are also only along a single trait in the system, right? And every system has multiple traits, meaning it's a mess. It looks like this, right? So if we try our best to try to keep enhancing in a linear direction, just to optimize along specific traits that we're aware of, there's so much that we're not aware of in a system. We know we cannot map fully a complex system now, right? What we realize is rather than having to fixate from moving from one stage of evolution to another, what we really need to do is enhance evolvability within systems. What we mean by that is we've seen this a lot in the popular literature and a lot in how we've seen big organizations conduct their adaptation. So this is the learning organization by Peter Senge, for example, recognizing that the only thing we can do is consistently improve our capability so that we're evolving, but we're also enhancing our ability to evolve, our ability to adapt, our ability to respond, right? In a lot of organizations, we've seen them trying to introduce that learning culture, a culture of curiosity, for example. So we've seen elements of this now, right? In some of the clients that we work with. So this is what we mean by moving from just thinking about evolution, which is very much focused from going from stages to stages, is to actually think about what is my capability to evolve? How can I improve so that when the situation presents certain things and it is best possible at that time, I have the resources capable to exploit that opportunity, right? So this is a bit of the background, the basis of evolvability. I'll go into more technical definitions now. So in evolutionary biology, right, evolvability is actually, to evolve is to mutate, right? The problem again, if we're only looking to optimize all the time, is you're actually trying to control for mutation, control for variability when you're optimizing, right? So when you're overly, sort of swung into an optimizing mode, you are reducing your evolvability because you're trying to reduce that mutation, right? This is again the ability to generate adaptive genetic diversity that can be replicated. That is evolvability. So, for example, if you move from one country to another, so I live in a very sunny part of the world, right? We are very close to the equator, right? You don't want to stay the same. I don't want to optimize, for example, for cold sort of tolerance, right? I need to allow my system to adjust, to adapt, to actually cope with heat, right? So again, if I optimize only in one direction, I cannot deal with environmental stressors, right? So this is a very crude example, but we can start to bring this into organizations who are going through some type of optimizing trench, right? So we see this, and I'll use, again, very general examples. Some of the things that I've seen in some of the clients that I work with is they tend to swing, and I'm sure that you've seen it either in your organization or organizations you have worked with. There is this constant swing between centralization and then trying to distribute, right? So modularization, centralization, modularization. Every 3 to 4 years, particularly big organizations, right? They go through this consistent sort of pulse. It's pulsing, right? And a lot of people don't like this pulsing. It causes a lot of disruption in the organization. But that 3 to 4 year sort of switch between modes is actually enhancing your evolvability, right? Again, the change is not a straight line. The change is actually sort of going through this disruption, stabilization, and then, certain things we optimize, right? We only optimize when it's fully stable, right? So we start to see that as well in organizational rhythms, because organizational evolvability, when we bring it into the work that we do, is really about the capacity for your organization and that particular system to encourage adaptive evolution. So your centralization is actually attempting to stabilize and optimize. We found certain patterns we need to stabilize now and find the ones that really work and optimize them. We centralize, we coordinate, and we distribute the things that you should be doing. And then when you've over centralized, what happens? You realize, well, we're not actually learning enough. And we move into that more decentralized, let's distribute, let's modularize, and then we learn. So there's that consistent pulse, right? We see this as well in a lot of other things that are on the market. The innovation loop, for example, is similar. It's a explore and exploit tension, right? So we're actually in a lot of the frameworks and a lot of the actual practices that people do, we realize that it's trying to encourage evolvability, right? It's that evolvability tension. You need both because then you're actually understanding that there are more than one type of curve, right? Because organizations are living systems. We need to allow them to learn, adapt, and evolve. But that optimizing type of push, that is also something that is not always present in a natural system. Natural systems are not going to say, oh, we need to optimize for shareholder value now, right? Actually, natural systems don't have that impulse. That is a human system impulse. So those are some of the things we need to be aware of. In human systems, sometimes we swing too far into an optimizing mode, right? So how do we manage that tension? How do we make sure that we're capturing for all the different types of curves? So one of the things that we recommend to help organizations actually bring those curves in a bit more authentically and organically into how we're already thinking is a sense, adapt, and respond loop, right? So what we mean by this is sensing is really around incorporating a lot of diversity of perspectives, distributing the ability to sense make across your system, right? Do you have sufficient feedback loops into the front end of your system? Because that's where they're going to be sensing mutation a lot more, right? how tight or how loose are your authority structures? How quickly can people actually speak to one another and locate one another across the system if they need to actually report on some of the things that they're seeing, right? Are there small signals? Do you have the right feedback loop so that these small signals can still be fed into someone who has the ability to see the broad picture so they can corroborate, right? And then within your system, do you have sufficient psychological safety so people can actually speak up and say, this doesn't seem quite right, or you've asked us to do this, but this is what we're seeing, right? It's because a lot of top-down led change when the message comes from the top, and we do need to communicate with intent and clarity, right? What we found is the message isn't just one way, right? It's actually fed one way, and then the people who actually do the work, what they're saying is the higher ups want to do this. They're not just saying let's do this, right? They're saying the higher ups want to do this. This is what we're currently doing. Let's figure out how to make this work. They're actually making sense of your message. And then within that, they're adapting it to suit their particular circumstances, the particular conditions that surround their work. Change has to be made to work by the people on the ground, right? That's one of the things we have to be mindful of. It doesn't just happen, right? So one of the things that we also talk about is this adaptation component, right? Is your purpose, your vision, your values when you communicate them, allowing for sufficient adaptability when they actually hit the ground, right? So the people on the ground are going to be dealing with a lot of situational shifts. Can they reconcile what you're saying, right? And is there broad enough? How can we strike that balance between being clear, being sort of very strong in our vision to allowing for that ability for people to adapt and have personal variability when they make sense of the message within your message within their realities, right? Does your system allow for people to actually have wide experimentations to learn so that, again, change has to be made to work. So it doesn't mean that they're going to get it right on the first time. They have to say, okay, the higher ups want us to do this. Let's try a whole bunch of stuff to see how we can actually meet their vision of the world. They need to experiment and widely and learn, right? So when you're communicating, it's not just about vision. It's also communicating about, these are the budget that you have for learning about how we can make this work, right? Are we giving and affording the system and its agents the right nimbleness, the flexibilities to make those changes, to self-organize, right? So this sense adapt loop, right, is actually really important because this is ongoing at any given moment. We always have multiple sense adapt loops. Now, the issue is actually a lot of the time, what organizations focus on is the formal response, right? How do we respond? How do we respond? Right? But the formal response is a lagging thing. The sense adapt loop is tightly coupled. It's ongoing all the time. Right? Organizations tend to keep thinking about the response, but this is a lagging aspect because these are all of the changes. These are all of the signals. I see the broad picture now. How do we actually start to realign everything? Right? How do we actually create a broader coherence with what we're seeing? How do we actually do some very formal reprioritization? We're not, getting enough information from this particular space. These are the people we need to loop in to do co-creation with. How do we build stakeholdership? These are very sort of well thought through responses. Now, that is the difference between a response and adaptation. Sensing and adaptation takes place on an ongoing loop. There's tightly coupled, right? That's actually where we need to be designing our changes to allow for the flexibility for them to make sense of your change message, right? Instead of just focusing on the formal response, right? So to make this bit more palatable and easy to understand, what I'd like to do is use a simple case study. This is a classic case study that's been used in a lot of masters of businesses worldwide, just the new Coke case study. So everyone has had a Coke, I'm assuming, right? It's a very popular brand. It's been around for a long time. So what happened is the Coke formula, I don't know if you guys are aware, has actually gone generally unchanged since its founding, right? It had been a very popular drink. However, in the 1980s, I don't know if you guys recall, there was a taste challenge, right? Where people would give you a blind taste test, have several different colas on the table, and then make you choose which one you like best. Right? I don't know if you guys recall this. I recall the advertisements on TV, right? So what happened is it was called the Pepsi challenge. And what they realized is in a blind taste test, people tended to pick the Pepsi more often, right? So what they surmised from this is, oh my goodness, Pepsi has a better formula. People are liking that smooth, sweet taste more, right? So what do we do? So Coke did several market research tests, found that yes, they like this new formula, and then they made this very bold and wrong decision, right, in 1985 to actually introduce a new Coke, a reformulated version of their cola recipe, and also discontinue the original Coke in one bold move, right? But what they didn't expect is that the market would have such a strong reaction, right? A lot of people saying, no, this is not Coke. This is not what we wanted. They had a huge backlash. It was one of the biggest marketing boo-boos, right? And that's why they still study it in MBA schools now, because within 79 days of introduction of this new Coke, they had to go back on all of their messaging. Say, okay, well, we introduced the new Coke. Up till today, it's gone unchanged. And now one of their slogans is always the real thing, right? But what we do see, again now, right? So again, let's put this back in a sense, adapt and respond loop, is they sensed that something was wrong. They wanted to change. They wanted to meet the market. But instead of going through several small adaptive moves, what did they do? They did market research and launched a big response. Right. So what we realize is actually that's the wrong move. We need to be going through multiple sense and adapt sort of experiments and have very small micro responses that might make up, a bigger strategy. Right. So what you see in the market now, for example, are you have cherry Coke, you have Coke Zero, you have Coke Light. Do you realize the number of Cokes you can buy in the market now? Right? But they still keep the real thing because they recognize that, again, we're sensing and adapting. We need to experiment. There are different segments of the market, but we're not going to launch a big response. So again, sense and adapt as a loop, very tightly coupled, right? Let's not over focus on the response. That's why in the book, you'll notice that it's sense and adapt with capital S, capital A, and a small r, because our responses need to be small. Right. So that's where, again, you're starting to see this push for more safe to fail experimentation, right? Let's shift into more portfolio type investments, right? Because we recognize that we need to balance where we're putting money into a broad portfolio. We can overemphasize one area or another, right? Because what we're realizing is, again, right, sense, adapt, respond. Right. That's why a lot of organizations are starting to shift into that more, let's take small moves, calculated, let's do more minimum viable, and then we learn and move on, right? So how do we actually build that into our transformation cycles as well, right? So I will add a quote here by Carl Weick. I really love this quote. Carl Weick is one of the fathers of sense making in organizations, right? He said one of the critical things that we need to be starting to shift ourselves toward thinking is it's not an organization. We are organizing. We're always organizing. It's in verb form. It's always being done, right? Change is not a one-time thing. You don't move from one state to another. Change is consistently unfolding. There is always a flow of possibilities, a whole bunch of events that are open-ended at any given time. We need to make sure that we're building the capabilities for organizing, not just focusing on organization. So a lot of people obsess again, right? When change is underway, oh, where is my box? Because they're looking at the organizational structure. They want to know which box they fit into. Where is my reporting line? And that is important. But however, once they get past that stage, they say, still not enough. I don't know the operating model. I don't know who I'm supposed to be talking to. Now that's where the real work hits the ground. So that is the piece that from an evolvability perspective, we need to be very mindful of, not just releasing new structures, new boxes, but really thinking, how do we actually ensure that the work gets done in the best manner possible? Right. So I've gone through now a little bit about a broad overview of evolvability. What I'm going to go into now is a very specific aspect, which also builds in some of those curves that, or those adaptive multi-directional curves that we talked about. Because Doug says that he has found this particular portion useful, and he said that this is something organizations do struggle with in his particular world part of the world and what he's seeing. So the book also talks about certain sense-making gaps that change typically creates, and we're not always effectively meeting. Right. So one of the gaps that we're going to talk about here is actually the second one is how do we remember to forget? Right, which is a funny thing to say, how to remember to forget. But again, right, this is the difference between a human system and a natural system. In a natural system, remember, they work with what is best available, right? They don't have biases that help, build resilience to change, right? You see that a lot of you might have heard of immunity to change, right? That's built hard, baked into the system. People don't actually like to be made to change. Some other things, for example, are, oh, I've already gone halfway into doing this, and you're telling me I need to stop now. People tend to keep going, right? Because they don't want to stop a pet project. They get attached. They develop biases. Those things don't exist in a natural system, right? They work with what's best available at any given time. In human systems, however, we're dealing with human systems of attachment, human systems of immunity, human systems as well in that manner. So that's where it changes, right? One of the fundamental differences as well between natural and human systems. So what we're going to introduce here is something that was developed by a gentleman called Bill Sharp. So Bill Sharp actually developed this Three Horizons framework. It's been used in a lot of situations worldwide. Very famously, it was used to help the UK to chart their digital transformation for the whole country. It's also been used in things like innovating education systems, and also now being brought into organizations to help them with their transformation. So I have made small adaptations from Bill's version, just to clarify. All I've done is I've renamed the horizons. The first horizon, second and third, so the three horizons, I've just changed the numbering. So, but apart from that, I've tried to retain the integrity of what Bill created, just applying it to more of an enterprise and organizational setting. So what he says is that oftentimes what we sort of start with is starting to realize, oh, this current world that we're living in is changing, right? Let's look at the broad trends. Let's look at the broad patterns, right? We know that the future is going to look different. We know that we need to adapt the things that we're doing, not necessarily working anymore. So what we're starting to see is, oh, people are experimenting. This might work in the future. It's the sense, right, that we need to start charting a new direction. So if you look at the chart, you'll see on the y-axis, it's the level of strategic fit that your organization has with its external environment, right? And then on the x-axis, it's time horizon, right? Now transition into the future. The first horizon on the Three Horizons framework is really the vision, right? We're starting to see, okay, the future requires us to be different. Some of the things that we're working right now seem to be working. It's gaining traction. It makes sense for the future, right? So what happens is we start to chart some transformation plans based on that. This is often derived from scanning the market, identifying patterns, having some vision of the future, right? That sets a direction. However, we're also aware that there's too much we don't know. We're going to have to learn, and it's going to emerge as part of the process, right? The problem is, and I love this quote also, it's around organizational memory. They say there is a goddess of memory, but there's actually none of forgetting. But there should be, because they walk on either side of us, right? Disputing for sovereignty and who we are until our death, which is a beautiful way of putting it. Of course, Richard Holmes is not talking about organizational change, but I really love this quote. And I think it's just as applicable to organizational change. For those of us who have lived through the systems that we're in or working in, right, we can recall, oh, two transformations ago that was like this. I really like that transformation. This worked really well. I don't know why they're doing this, right? This I don't understand. But the truth is, once you get into this change, two to 3 years later, right before they announce the next big change, you're going to get attached to that. Right. So that's the reality of human systems. We get attached to things, right? So we need to actually have those different horizons, time horizons in mind, those different tendencies, human tendencies in mind as we start to manage and help organizations to shepherd that change. So here is where I like to bring in and remember the other shapes of adaptation I introduced earlier. So the first horizon is not the only horizon that we have to deal with. It's not just about going from where we are to the future, right? What we also need to be mindful of, again, is this one on the left, the second horizon, is the thing that you're doing now might not be 100% fit for the future. However, right, it's fit for now. It was fit for the past couple of years, right? It kept business running as usual. You don't just switch that off, right? There needs to be a process of slowly sunsetting it. There needs to be some kind of sustaining innovation that you're still introducing into the business so that you can keep the lights on. You don't do this big dramatic switch because it requires too much from your war chest, right? How do you actually slowly create a sunsetting horizon? How can we do some things to keep the lights on and exploit the model we do have whilst it's still exploitable, right? Until such time that it has zero strategic fit. Right now, the reason why your organization is designed the way it is because it's exploiting the conditions that have been fit for it, right? And it's not going to change tomorrow. It's going to change over a period of time. So what do we need to do to keep the lights on? We don't just go immediately into the future, right? And then we also need to be mindful that there's a third horizon. This is the real place where the change takes place. This is your world in transition. Typically, they say this is the type of persona that is more entrepreneurial, right? Because this is that intermediate space where those first and second horizons are going to collide. It's about building stepping stones, right? How can we actually slowly navigate? How can we bring things into experiment with? How do we actually slowly increase our strategic fit? And recognize, again, it's an experiment because you see that it goes back onto a down curve because we recognize some things are not going to be the right strategic fit. If you're experimenting, and I'll take a digital innovation example with some of my clients, right? In manufacturing, they're trying to bring in machine learning AI, and they say that their CEO saying, just tell me what will work and then we'll invest in that. But the digital team is saying, actually, we don't know what will work. We need to invest in these 3 technologies, right? So it's not about not investing or investing everything. It's about, again, managing how you invest, right? Could be in cycles, could be across a portfolio, right? Because you're building those stepping stones to test. We know a lot of them will fail. There is no bang on type of investment. So for example, right now we see a whole bubble, right? The biggest investment bubble in the world right now is around generative AI, right? So in a lot of investment books, they say that bubbles are spoken about in a bad way, but bubbles are necessary. You need that investment bubble. You need that huge injection of cash into one area so you can start to stabilize the technology and sift it out so that you get the ones that work, right? So now it's generative AI, but maybe 5, 10 years ago, it was actually around machine learning. Machine learning is pretty stable now, right? But now we're starting to see that bubble around generative AI. And the bubbles are necessary. So it's similar to this third horizon. When you're in a world in transition, right, you need to experiment a lot, right? You need to test what has a strategic fit. So we've seen these three horizons separately. I'm going to bring them together now. Actually, all three horizons are always present, right? They're present at any given point in time when you're on going through any form of change, right? However, at some point, right, your second horizon, your business as usual, because it's losing strategic fit over time, right? However, it's going to take time, it's going to take experimentation, it's going to take reorganization to, as it slowly declines. And you need to be experimenting, you need to be supporting that transition. And the things here are a lower strategic fit than your current business as usual, right? But at some point, it will overlap it. It will go and become more effective than the second horizon. That's when it'll start to replace aspects of business as usual, right? So we need to be aware, we need to be mindful for those inflection points. Again, we said there's going to be a lot more testing than what's actually going to be strategically fit. Some of the things that you bring in, some of the things that you think are innovative, that's got a right fit, right? They might get absorbed. They might not lead to much change, but that's okay because that helps us to learn, right? Other forms of disruption, right? Some things we're bang on the money and they can take us from where we are today all the way to this overlap point. But that's not typical, right? Mostly we have to experiment, we have to fumble our way into the future. There is no crystal ball. So this triangle here, do you see that? With the pink arrows, this is space. This is what they call a triangle of change, right? This is where you start to see a lot of overlapping of the different time horizons. This is the disrupting point, right? So I don't know if you guys can see it. If you look at the second and first horizon, you see this is a disrupting curve because remember the phenotypes don't know what is the right fit. So they're struggling. That's your disrupting curve, right? And your third horizon is actually your stabilizing curve. So you need to be absorbing the variability and finding ways to constructively experiment with it. So this is high level concept. What I'm going to do is bring it down to a real world example so we can demonstrate what it might look like in industry. So the example I've chosen is energy transition because I think this is something that everyone can relate to. Even if we don't work in energy, it's something that I'm sure we're concerned about. So first example is the first one that we want to talk about is the first horizon, right? In this particular case, this is the vision, remember? So the vision here is potentially widespread adoption of renewable energy resources, right? Decentralized, potentially more modular microgrids rather than integrated, right? So for example, some of these might be investments in large scale solar, wind farms. We think that in the future, these will dominate energy generation and advanced storage solutions to balance supply and demand. Instead of having these big grid systems. So one of the projects that I work on is actually in Puerto Rico right after Hurricane Maria, and their energy systems were completely disrupted. It was an opportunity to rebuild, right, in a very different way, shape, and form, because they had these central tracks. And Puerto Rico is an island, but it's very mountainous. So what happened is they realized that because of the way the grid had been built, there's a lot of weak points. So a lot of many parts of the island had no energy because of the way the grids were built. So they said instead of having these central delivery systems, we need to shift into microgrids, right? Because there is an opportunity now in a lot of places, right? People have solar panels, they might be collecting too much energy. They're actually selling their energy back into the system. There is a different way to generate, right? And at the same time, if we change it into microgrids, communities and individuals can actually manage their energy. There's more resilience if you actually build it in a microgrid system. Smart grids as well, particularly with AI, machine learning, again, distribution and consumption in real time can be tracked, right? Properly allocated, right? A lot of countries are still dealing with load shedding. For example, if we start to transition into these types of systems, we don't have to worry so much about load shedding. So on a broader level, if we're thinking about energy production, there's a lot of buzz now around hydrogen as the next energy source. But the problem now is the technology is there, but not necessarily scalable. Cost is too high, right? So these are some examples of what the vision of the future might look like. However, we're not going to get there over time. A lot of these are major capital expenditure projects, 10, 20 years of construction and development, right? And capability building to manage them. We're not there yet, right? So what are we going to do over the next 10 to 20 years, right? So we recognize that if we're in energy, right, we need to manage by optimizing our existing structure whilst we diversify into these new systems, right? How can we optimize existing structure and revenue streams? So some examples, again, it's carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So it's that helps people to extend the life of their infrastructure whilst reducing emissions. So that's one of the games, right? We meet carbon, but we also allow for carbon storage. So it balances it out. Instead of replacing the grid completely into microgrids, can we actually start to upgrade our grids so that it has a hybrid, right? More than one source, more than one type. Efficiency improvements, margin optimization, really a lot of small margins. How can we improve here? How can we improve there? Value chain optimization. How can we think across the whole feed of our system, right? So this is, again, we are losing strategic fit, but that doesn't mean we stop business overnight. We need to start transitioning, but we need to transition in a smart way so we can keep the lights on and actually create the funds necessary for the investment into this first horizon, right? And then this third one is really more around transitional tactics, right? Your third horizon. How do we experiment? How do we experiment with innovation? How do we actually do strategic investments that can fundamentally help alter our business? So some examples of how this has been brought into industry is peer-to-peer energy trading, right? So, particularly with upgrading your grids, the way they are functioned, how can we actually allow people to do that? Blockchain technology has been brought in now for energy management so that it's more secure, transparent. There isn't a lot of loss that is untrackable. New technology, new materials. The problem now is not that we don't have enough sun, but we don't have efficient storage, right? How can we actually improve in those areas? So from an investment perspective, it could be, how do I invest strategically across a portfolio, right? Small learning feedback loops. So you're working with a system that you're going with minimum viable to get you to the next stage of learning, but you're also experimenting across a portfolio, right? It could be, do we build a new infrastructure here, right? What is the potential for that? Do we have local partners that we can actually help to offset some of the costs of your capex? Because that's one of the trends that we're seeing as well, is people are no longer going into fund, for example, future energy energy infrastructure like hydrogen, for example. They're not doing it independently. They're doing this in partnership because we recognize that to manage risk, you go above brand, right? You might do it across a competitor so you can learn together. You might actually partner with your customer. So your customer becomes a vested stakeholder, right? You might be investing in a combination of technology, right? So I want to buy over this battery company because it looks promising. But at the same time, I need to be building supply solutions. I need to be building different types of solutions. So that portfolio management becomes important, right? So I am mindful that I have spoken for a very long time and I did not leave sufficient time for Q&A. So I'm going to pause here. Doug, over to you. That's all I had. It's really just to encourage us to sense and adapt more, not just focus on the response.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Zhen. And I think that's been beneficial for many of the people on the call. One of the things that I'm reflecting on is you guys, we've probably got room for a couple of questions. So as you're mulling over what you might want to ask. The first is with the three horizons. Something that I've found very useful about that is that as an organization is going through change, everyone can have a voice and everyone can see where they are. Right. So you'll have some people that are like, hey, we need to maintain what we're doing here. And so we can illustrate where they have a voice. There's some people like, hey, I see this amazing future. And so we can show them where they fit as well. And then there's those that are wanting to disrupt and make change. And so all of those can be present and are present at the same time. Because what often happens in these kind of big changes is people get disconnected and they end up unsure of where they fit. And this is a way to sort of communicate or frame the whole picture for them. The other thing is with the sense, adapt, respond. That can happen within a team as well. So it can kind of work at multiple scales. I guess the first question from my perspective is you're talking earlier about pulsing and that there's these tensions. What would be some indicators that someone would look out for to initiate a pulse between, say, a centralized or a distributed decision making, or maybe other tensions that you've seen?
So that's actually something that we do also talk about in the book. So in one of the chapters, which I think it's called "There Is Your Roadmap," and then there is what really happens. I really like that title because I think that that's true of all transformation journeys, right? We usually talk about the different approaches to change. So we're very familiar with some, for example, the Big Bang approach, right? So senior management announces this, it rolls down, it trickles down, everyone has to do it, right? What we found is that typically triggers a lot of resistance, and also a lot of it becomes a target on the back of the senior exec who actually initiates it. So it's not always the best approach. So some of the other approaches we've seen are, for example, taking an incubator approach to change, right, is to have a microsystem running in parallel side by side between with your business as usual system, right? So that you're always experimenting and slowly feeding change into the system. But one of the things that we also caution is you don't want to put your incubator too far apart from business as usual, because when the change starts to be introduced, it also starts to trigger your immunity. So how do we actually create some coupling between different departments, between different personnel that actually already effectively play out those tensions? So for example, you might have people in your innovation team coupled with people in business development and marketing, because you see two very different sort of dispositions. And if you couple them, right, they're always pulling at each other, but it's a constructive tension, right? So the way we couple, that's another one of the other approaches that we talk about. And we also make a distinction in the book between planned approaches and also emergent approaches. Right, so we're very familiar with the planned approaches, which I am talking about now. Either your Big Bang, your incubator approach, or this third one is really that thin slice approach, which is becoming quite popular in organizations, where they recognize that we have to show that the change is good, so that the change will slowly shift perceptions, and then it creates a momentum that can bring the rest of the organization on board. So with the thin slice approach, what we're seeing is typically organizations have a value stream, right? How work starts, how it flows across to the next department, so on and so forth, until it hits the customer. So is there parts of the organization we can cover a thin slice that hits the whole value stream, right? And helps us to demonstrate the change in a part of the organization, so it creates momentum. That we've seen very practically working very well. But the challenge that we will say is a thin slice is an inorganic metaphor. How do you slice an organization in a thin way? Because there are informal networks and systems this change is happening in my department. Or why isn't it happening in mine? There's this sense of tension, favoritism. The word starts to travel. There is no genuine way to slice thinly. So what we recommend is a combination of approaches. So this is how you would plan it. Then on the emergent side, which is the things that you cannot plan for, we talk about, for example, Dave Snowden's vector theory of change, right? You nudge in a particular direction with small experiments, right? I know that AGLX utilizes this quite a bit. So the other thing that we introduce is this, and to me, I think it's actually the most important, is recognizing that your systems and your change needs to be nested. Right. So what this means is, for example, we talk about the case study of GE, right, and how Emelch brought in a lot of changes. And he said that the most important thing for him was to be very disciplined about how he nested the initiatives. So a lot of times the change tends to start from specific parts of the organization, could be, product development, business development, right? And then that starts to trickle down into other parts of the organization, even if it's not a part of your roadmap, right? For example, in his particular case, it was HR, it was performance management. If you're starting to say that this is what we're going to value, this is how the system's going to function now, and you don't fix your performance management in parallel, right? Your change is going to fail, right? So even though his plan was not to have the performance management system touched until much later in the journey, he said, if I had to nest this in my transformation journey, in terms of being disciplined about it, it's hitting, the impact is felt first. So I need to bring this up, right? Bring this up, the priority change. So he said we need to change our performance management system. And for GE, it was revolutionary. They changed from having these once a year promotion days to having actually quarterly reviews, right? So they changed their feedback
Seems
loops.
that you've
from-
paused it.
Sorry, Doug, I think there was a lag and I didn't catch what you said.
I think I had it frozen on my side. Maybe I'm the problem, which can happen from time to time. I think we'll need to wrap it up there. What I've put in the chat is a link to Zhen's book, so please go and buy that. I've put a link to her LinkedIn profile. I see, Jim, you're showing you've got the book.
Got the book.
Fantastic.
Got the book, reading it. Zhen, you've outdone yourself. Thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you, Jim.
Awesome. And we'll share this. If you registered for the webinar, we'll send it out to your email. I've also put the AGLX LinkedIn page because we'll be sharing it on there as well. But just a massive thank you to you, Zhen, and an acknowledgement of all the hard work that you put in, taking all this experience and knowledge from over the years and turning it into a really useful book, and then presenting that to us today. So please go back to Zhen or myself after this if you've got any further questions. And thank you so much, everyone, for showing up to the webinar today. We'll close.
Thank you, Doug, for putting it on.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.